I think is that I have stumbled into something so broad and difficult to figure out what are the common themes from one country to another. But I suspect that the system of classification would begin with what is the nature of, what is the institution called? What is it officially supposed to, who officially is supposed to be going in there? Recognizing that unofficially, whenever you set up one of these disciplinary institutions, they end up catching a lot of fish that they didn't want to originally start out with, but somebody sent them there, and that's fine. So the original purpose, but then I think to the extent that one can find it out, which I think, again, is this extremely detailed study, and you might, this might actually be exactly the kind of work you've already done, is to find who can send there and under what circumstances, with what success and what duration. And so who can do the imprisoning and under what procedures and processes. And I think it's a rather large topic that I just found my way into.
It's interesting to me, I wondered if the special prisons that you had run across were also sometimes just, kind of halfway houses or battered women's shelters, or were they punitive?
No, not at all. We're talking, most of these, several examples are Islam. They are prisons. They're punitive. There's nothing pro-woman. No.
Okay, thank you. That's interesting.
And you had a second question?
Yeah, my second question was about female violence against men, or mutual violence within relationships. We know that, at least in the United States, statistically, that it's very common that there's substance abuse problems between both partners, and that leads to mutual violence within relationships. And it's just something that's very difficult to parse out from the past. But interestingly, I do know that in Mexico City, in some divorce cases, I haven't seen this elsewhere, but it's specifically in Mexico City, there is a really sizable number of men who testified that their wives beat them. And, which is surprising. You wouldn't expect that, and you don't see that necessarily elsewhere, but it was a good maybe, 10 to 20%. So it does raise this question about what, if anything, you've encountered in your broad reading about mutual violence and how that's categorized.
2 points about this, which is, one is the kind of global history of domestic homicides, and just to state the overall point about domestic homicide is this is the best researched area of family violence, and the one where you have more belief in the records than and more and richer kind of case studies. And on the whole, that very large literature tends to posit the women as acting in self-defense. That is, something's been done to them first, and that they are, and that there's a fairly long history of it. So that the idea that there is a woman who is initiating without context, that is, without a long history that she has been suffering physical, verbal abuse, deprivation, etc. It's just not there in the homicide records. And then the other one, that point would go along with the sociologist Michael Johnson's. He has different categories of domestic violence, and one category would be this kind of mutual fighting, but he likes another category which has a popular term. He calls it domestic terrorism. But the domestic terrorism, that is it's much more unequal, and there's a long pattern of abuse. That's much more what you find in the long history of murders in comparative world history. Okay, now second point is you can go to the The incidence literature, which is now basically an industry in every country, is conducting these kind of conflict tactics scale surveys, and they do not report a kind of mutual violence. They in fact report quite extreme differences.
May I ask a question? Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm teach Russian history here. Thank you for your talk. It was impressive and I learned a lot. I guess I want to ask a question about the category of age and whether or not age had any salience in either, I mean, any of the reading that you did, either in the kind of new notions of patriarchy or anything that you read about domestic violence in general. And I think, of course, from the Russian, what I know about Russian history. So the story for 19th century Russia within peasant communities is that when young peasant women are married, they move to their husband's home, and there's a kind of expectation of violence by the father-in-laws. There's even kind of terminology for that. So I just wonder if you found in your reading kind of age as a category within various cultures over time.
Let's break this down by in-law relations and age. So first, to the social science literature on domestic violence, usually, as is the literature also on violence in general, people run out of steam. Their rage quiets down as they get older. Either couples find some way of living together more peacefully, or they've kind of gone to their corners so that they know how to fight, or they've just simply separated and gone their separate ways. But there is an age relationship so this is not as common among your older set. And then I just touched here on the how important in-law relations are to a global history of domestic violence, and that in-law relations would be much more important in a non-Western context in discussing who gets to hit, under what circumstances, et cetera. And so you might be emphasizing the father-in-law, but in India, China, the literature is much more about the mother-in-law. Oh, is she terrifying? And then you have so many young women who are running away because the mother-in-law can exercise power. And it's in both cases, the father-in-law or the mother-in-law, it's within a context where the daughter-in-law is moving into the house, a new household. She's not with her family relations, but in a new household in which she is a property that is now is expected to learn patterns of obedience, do the labor, and be disciplined. And she's essentially a servant of the family. And so part of what they're doing is they are teaching her through many disciplinary methods. And what did Barbara, I can't remember, what did Barbara Engel find out about this in her?
Yeah, so that's one of the historians I'm thinking of. She describes this very much within
And is it mostly father-in-law, or is it mother-in-law too?
there's some mother-in-law, but it
Mostly.
father-in-laws. Yeah.
And are there specific circumstances that activate it? Some kind of situation?
Nothing that's coming to my mind at this moment. It's just mostly confirming what we thought that we already knew about peasant cultures in the earlier part of the 19th century. She shows for later. Yeah. Thank you.
Anyone else? Yes, Rita.
Hi, thank you very much for your great survey of physical violence in domestic life. I have a general commentary, one question. The commentary is that the problem is that history of cruelty is not the history of physical domestic violence. I was worried when you spoke about domestic violence in class, upper class and lower classes. And I suddenly remember this, no? That sometimes we get confused between domestic physical violence and domestic cruelty, which today our laws in Latin America, they try to speak about these different kinds of cruelty of different kinds. So you may have an upper class environment with very fine cruelty against women, but which cannot be traced in terms of physical scandalous violence, as you said. So from that general commentary, I remember the issue of discourse. But the problem with a great survey like that is the changes in the way we speak about violence. For example, when we come to modern times, the way we separate the intimate from the public changes dramatically. So with the advent of modernity, the way we speak about what happens in intimate life becomes completely different than the way we speak in pre-modern or non-modern times. So how can you compare that? I was a little bit uncomfortable about that. For example, in modern discourse, the norm is based on equality, so it conceals inequality. So you will have the norm, the normative discourse, the juridical discourse, all the time concealing the issue or trying to get away from the status. As Carol Bateman, for example, has said, the difference in status between men and women. So it will be trying hardly to conceal the status difference between men and women. But in non-modern societies, in tribal societies, for example, and I am an anthropologist, so you have their norm trying to explicit inequality. So their norm is about hierarchy in society. But that doesn't mean that hierarchy is absent from modernity, but it's only concealed. I don't know if I can make it clear. Perhaps when I speak later on, I can speak better about that. So when one compares discourses, it's very important to remember that difference in the way things are explicited in the law.
Okay. Your first point was that there are new laws, say in Brazil, that deal with domestic cruelty and I thought I'll respond to your second point and just let you expand on this, because North American and Western European law, it would mostly be, the expansion would be within the category of the history of divorce, where you're going into the expansion of kinds of matrimonial cruelty, but then that goes away as you get into no-fault divorce, and so that kind of distinction is there in the law of divorce and then goes away. I tried to, in the brief discussion about privacy, touch on what is an absolutely huge topic, which is that the discourse of domestic violence, as you point out, has a, if there is a very broad shift, it is a discourse in which you are accepting moderate chastisement, and where it is a discourse of inequality, and then you're moving over to what we're calling modern, which is no longer a chastisement, a norm of equality, but within which there are many.
The law becomes the crime.
It becomes.
Becomes the crime. So, but it's only a change in
It, yes, and I would accept that your point is one thing that historians must study is the discourse itself. And here I would say that the best people who are studying this are the legal anthropologists such as Sally Mary, and there are a number of others, and there are books here. But what they're picking up is your second phase of discourse, which is the norm of equality, and then buried within it all of the hierarchical and patriarchal assumptions. And where you can find this best and most explicitly stated is really subsequent to the 1990s, because of the UN developing out of its various eliminations it's developing an international standard of human rights and human rights violations. But then what all of these studies do is then they show you all the different debates within each country that is asking for an exception to this rule. And the arguments about exception are essentially discourses or debates or contests about how to insert patriarchy within a universalistic human rights discourse. And they are working overtime on this, but it often happens in countries that have some kind of Sharia law, because they'll want to say, yes, domestic violence is a crime, it's a violation of human rights, but if a woman disobeys her husband in this way or that way, then we do want to make an exception. And many places do make those exceptions. I'd also want to insert another category into the international framing discourses, and then how hierarchy is discussed. And the other fascinating piece in this anthropological literature is when they get to I think it's mostly Americans, it's funding by it tends to be funding by USAID, and then they'll be holding workshops for example, the funniest article is Tanzania, where they're holding workshops and explaining, well, this is how we set up a battered women's shelter. There's other good literature that is about Ukrainian examples, etc. So they go over and they are setting up both a model of the U.S. as more advanced and also human rights as the discourse. And then the audience, the women will raise their hand and say, well, actually, a shelter, it wouldn't really work in our society where most people are rural. This idea of fleeing to this impersonal place that doesn't make any sense in our culture. We really need to develop more local solutions that are outside of this, and the kind of conversation going back and forth between our model and this won't fit our way is very interesting.
We have one more quick question, and we have to, because we're running against the clock. We have a very long day, and we don't want to get out of here at 9 o'clock tonight. So,
I'm Brian Peterson. I teach world history at FIU, and I loved your talk. It made me think about China, especially. You mentioned Confucianism, and it brought to mind the film Raise the Red Lantern, which is based on a novel. And in this, there's a household of an elite family in China that has a main wife and several concubines living together. And one of the concubines commits adultery, and then she is put to death in a special room in the extended household by the servant.